I wanted to welcome everyone who's seeing us for our first webinar here at Cloaked. I think we'll be doing more and more as we're starting to build our presence and our own credibility. But I want to introduce myself. My name is Arjun. I'm the CEO of Cloaked and the moderator of today's discussion. Today, we're here to talk about your privacy in 2025. There's a lot of unknowns next year, as we've kind of been seeing the last few weeks. I'm kind of excited to see what are we thinking about security, privacy, and all things data. It's going to be interesting to see how the next year unfolds. But I would love to talk about our challenges and opportunities that we, especially in our space, are looking ahead and trying to face and help address. But today, I'm excited to introduce some of our guests. We have author Sarah Lamdan, who's written some amazing work. So I'm excited to have her talk about her background, what she's been really digging into. And I really love this cybersecurity strategist, Justin. Justin Sherman's done a lot of good work, but as a team together, we'll be talking about the state of data broker industries, what's been going on, like our expectations for data privacy, security regulations, and personally, what I think about, especially here at Cloaked, what are the actions we can take to start getting control of our own data? As business leaders, individuals, there's a lot of work that we can do and work that we're trying to expect other people to change as we're thinking about what is the future of data. But to set the scene, just for everyone to know a little bit about Cloaked, we are a consumer-first privacy and security company committed to upholding what does it mean for our fundamental right to privacy? What does it mean to own our data, our identity? And personally, as an innovator and now a privacy advocate over the past few years, I'm eager to jump into what we're talking about today around privacy, security, and what we're seeing, most importantly, on the critical trends that are coming in the new year. But before that, I'd love to first introduce our speakers. First, our author of Data Cartels, Sarah Lamdan, and then second, cybersecurity and data strategist, Justin Sherman. I love, Sarah, if you could kick us off, just briefly describe your background and the book you wrote would be awesome to hear.
Yeah, hi, it's great to be here. And I'm excited to talk about data privacy. So I come to data privacy both as a lawyer, a law professor, and also a librarian. And I became aware of some major data brokers through actually my role as a librarian. In 2017, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, one of the enforcement branch of the Department of Homeland Security, was trying to create something it called the Extreme Vetting Program. Which it has created, which is a very invasive surveillance arm that really focuses on data-focused surveillance activities. And I noticed that legal research platforms were trying to bid on contracts to work on the surveillance program, this extreme vetting program. And I did not understand why a legal information platform, like a legal research platform, basically something that I used, as a teacher, as a law professor and a librarian, I didn't understand how an entity like that or a product like that would be involved in immigration surveillance. So I got curious and I started looking more into the structure of kind of modern research platforms and modern information companies generally. And what I found was that a lot of major publishers and major information platforms and research platforms were getting into data surveillance. So I really started to try to figure out why that was happening and kind of map out that industry. And what I learned was that personal information is special, it's unique, it's not fungible, like science information or legal information. Generally, information is not like oil or water. Every piece is unique. So the company that can get the most information to sell wins the game, right? Like if you have more data than anyone else, people are going to use your service. If you have more science than anyone else, people are going to use your service. If you have more legal information than anyone else, people are going to use your service. So a few companies had been kind of quietly consolidating and getting as much information under their corporate umbrellas as possible, which made them not only powerful information purveyors, like legal information or financial information, but also powerful personal data brokers. And I was really impressed by the amount of informational power that just a few companies held. And most of those companies get involved in personal data brokering because it is such an in-demand business, especially by these government entities that want to do surveillance. So that's how I came to it, and that's my work.
That's awesome to hear. I love to double click on that data consolidation and how everyone turns into surveillance over time, but we'll get into that. Justin, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Sure, and a plug for Sarah's book, highly recommend to students always. So, yeah, I come at this similar interest in some of those topics as a technologist and looking at this from a couple sides, both academic research programs as well as actually consulting on and with companies that are doing pro-privacy and cybersecurity behavior and practices, and as well as litigation matters on this issue. So, all to say, one of the things that has struck me most, I really want to double down on the point about the scale of this data collection, right? We've heard for any number of years, whether it's government surveillance scandals and allegations, whether it's Cambridge Analytica and data breaches, right? Just how much information is out there about us. But as Sarah noted, when you actually start pulling up how many data points particular companies, including data brokers, have collected on people, I mean, for some of them, 10, 15,000 data points on a single person. It really is hard to wrap your head around. Like, that's kind of an insane amount of data, right? We can play the name 5 fun facts about yourself game. And, okay, you can get by, but if that was name 15,000 things, that might be a little bit harder, right? So the scale of the data and also just the breadth and depth I've always found really interesting, right? The notion that it's not just information that was kept in filing cabinets for a long time in public records and marriage certificates and DMV records, but now it's all digitized and it's searchable in databases. And for example, it's sold to law enforcement. Or, hey, our phones are constantly pinging geolocation data, right? And you might have it so that one app doesn't collect that 24/7, but you have enough apps that collect location throughout the day that we can actually piece together where you are 24/7 and sell that in a database too. So it's really kind of frightening. But again, that's kind of what interested me in this issue in the first place is just the scale of the data collection, and not to mention the sale of data, as we're talking about, is a particularly interesting kind of dynamic in the way that it directly monetizes our information, really outside of our consent and control.
Well, I feel it's pretty productive conversation we can have around data brokers and data. So I'd love to jump into it. Just for today, like first off, let's talk about the data broker industry itself. I want to give just a little context as you both kind of illuminated a lot of interesting points. Data consolidation, part of data surveillance, the selling and permissibility of access to data. These are all kind of the vectors that data broker industry really jumps into. I know we've spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to clean people's information, what information's out there. And personally, what I've realized in this whole journey, as you both have uncovered, you said, Justin, 15,000 data points per person and just even one data broker. The scary thing that I've found is that a lot of companies right there, they're trying to build that best picture about the individual. But now to get anything about an individual, you can actually get everything using just a couple data points to tie right back to them. You talked about location, as we talk about emails, phone numbers, address, a few of these things can tie 15, 20,000 data points about you and start to build a better picture. Knowing that this is only getting worse and we're not talking a lot about what's the right way of kind of addressing this problem. I know, Justin, from your side of things, you've been doing a lot of research, and from Sarah, your side, even the book you wrote, what I'd love to unpack is, as this problem's getting worse, how have these companies kind of fought to kind of keep amassing their power? And when we're seeing the data breadth, they said 15,000, it's going to keep increasing. What's happening? Why is it happening? I kick it to either one who wants to take it first, but it's getting worse and we feel it. But why is that the case? Like, what's going on? How is it happening?
Yeah, I'll make a couple points and then kick it over to Sarah, and certainly happy too to kind of get into the various lobbying tactics that the industry uses, as you said, to keep this stuff going and growing. But first, you made a really important point about you mentioned linking data points back to a person, right? What's considered personally identifiable, and this is a really interesting issue because if you talk to someone who, and maybe this might be a company lawyer, but somebody who is really focused on what does the law say, it's things like, well, if we take out a name and we take out an email from this big data set, maybe, which is true, under certain regulations, that's considered not personally identifiable. That is hilarious when you look at actually the decades of peer-reviewed computer science and statistics literature, when you look at what companies, and as you said, ad companies and data brokers and others can do, which is you actually can combine massive data sets together where you can easily figure out who someone is. You can use things that aren't a name, but we all have a phone. If you have a phone, we all have a mobile ad ID that gets assigned to us from companies like Google that persistently tracks what goes on your device. So there's sort of this gap that we're seeing, and we've seen for years, but it's getting worse between what laws and regulations say are good baseline privacy protections and what actually are good baseline privacy protections in law and policy. So the second thing I'll just say related to that is, uh, you'll see that come up when data brokers talk about their data. They'll make claims about anonymization and other things, and we can get into that. Oftentimes, I've looked at specific cases, and that's factually incorrect. But the general point is, as Sarah noted, this is being sold because companies, I mean, there's money, right? There's money to be made in
Building that
monetizing.
profile. Yeah.
Exactly, and building these profiles and monetizing our information. So, all to say, to understand where this is going, we also have to look at those drivers. And some of that, which Sarah has done a lot more work on, is law enforcement purchasing of this data, because when law enforcement say have to go directly to your phone company to get information on you, they might need a warrant or a court order. They can buy it from a data broker with no warrant, no court order, no public disclosure whatsoever. This happens all the time. So that's one driver, is sort of government interest in monitoring and in lowest protection access to citizens' data. Another, of course, is the advertising ecosystem. And so anytime anything happens, like Google says we're going to get rid of third-party cookies, or a huge data broker involved company like Oracle shuts down its entire ad business, that shifts the market. So I'll kick it to
Yeah.
Sarah, but I think understanding those drivers, right? Who's actually buying this and why are they buying it is really important for looking ahead.
Yes. Sarah,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead. I've already a
Like,
lot of things. It's
yeah,
we're talking about, we're increasing the way that we can collect data. The law is kind of meaningless because we can always find a way around it, and we have big financial motivations. So there's a lot
yeah,
of emphasis on why this has to keep growing from a negative perspective. But I'm curious, kind of where.
yeah. Yeah, and I can speak a little bit to kind of the specifics of the legal the legal grease that kind of whatever greases the wheels of this whole product line. So Justin's absolutely right. So they create these universal identifiers for you. It's like a social security number, but it's privately held. Google has one, all the major data brokers have one, and they start amassing all of this data. And the more we create, the more we exist in a connected world, the more we create data. Like, right, like this kind of technology didn't even exist a few years ago, and this collects so many data points about me that can be sent to any data company, that I probably give permission. When I click I agree, I probably gave permission to send all of that data off to some sort of upstream data broker market. um, so we create more and more data, and the companies figure out more and more ways to make profits and also use the data. So they can sell data as a service, which is like a searchable platform with our, containing points of data about us. My data dossier is for sale somewhere from multiple places by multiple data brokers. They can also do something they can also do things called predictive and prescriptive services. So now we have these machine learning algorithms or artificial intelligence products where they can take our data, run it through, and predict how likely I might be to default on a loan or commit a crime, right? So they can sell that proprietary, very valuable information to law enforcement, to insurance companies, right? So not only do they sell our dossiers directly and our, kind of our full data mosaic, our data picture, they can also sell information that they contrive based on our data and running our data through various algorithms. And the big advantage that Justin spoke to is the way that government agencies especially can, and big public institutions like insurance companies, et cetera, can skirt data laws and privacy laws using these certain types of data brokers. So most major data brokers that serve the government don't give the government data sets over to the government. Instead, they sell subscriptions to their products, right? They're selling software as a service products that exist in their data servers in their cloud or whatever backup. And they say, oh, FBI, you want to be able to search for people? You can have, 50 passwords for this much money and you get a monthly subscription to our service. And in that way, no material ever really changes hands, right? It's just another research service. So government agencies can skirt the Fourth Amendment. And also there's something called the third party doctrine that does a lot of help with skirting Fourth Amendment warrant requirements. So there's this very outdated concept that when you give a piece of information out to an entity, be it a web service, your bank, whatever, you are waiving your privacy. You've shared that data with a third party, and that data then does not require, there's no warrant required to access that data. So that also helps in the Fourth Amendment context. But there are other privacy laws that these products help skirt. So one of the major ones that I like to point out is the Privacy Act of 1974. So this is a law that all federal government agencies are supposed to follow. And it really is a best data practices law. It says, hey, CIA, if you're going to start a major data collection about people, you have to follow all these steps. It has to be narrowly tailored. You have to let the public know, let people opt out, right? Basically give people control of their data and give people notice about what's going on with their data. And if you're just buying subscriptions to a service, you aren't collecting data. You never start that series of events that leads to Privacy Act applying to your data set or data work.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing I always like to approach. There's the legislative, and we always talk about we'll talk a good amount about what's going on legislation side of things, but companies always find a way because they're motivated by trying to build this type of understanding about the individual. The thing is, what you kind of alluded to, we're headed into this kind of world of where predictive modeling, our behavior, aspects of who we are, companies want to figure that out and start to shape or direct towards something. Government side, right? There's decisioning things from financial institutions, decisioning aspects. From other companies, it's around, let me sell this, buy this. Well, as this is evolving, and we know there's the whole looming aspect of AI, how do we think that this idea of data brokers continue to grow? What are the challenges that ultimately comes back to the fundamental question, why do we care? And that's always people always talk about, but this is only going to get worse. Why is this important for us to unpack? Why is it's something we wrestle with at Cloaked because we're talking about what does data removal look like? How do we stop the problem happening again? But fundamentally, this problem is a challenge that's going to keep growing. How should we think about and why it's important for the fundamental future?
So this is such an important question, as you said, because it is important. I don't like the dismissal of the theoretical, right? It is important to understand, as we're talking about theoretically, why these issues are a problem, and but it's very practical, right? And so I'll run through a couple examples. So for decades, data brokers have facilitated stalking and gendered violence. This is assault, this is murder, this is the hunting down of women, of children, of LGBTQ people. And the reason this has happened is a number of websites that are out there that are people search data brokers, right? The sort of one that pops up when you Google, a person's name and it's like the sketchy background check ad, right? And they're sort of, some of these literally say they're like, look up your Tinder date, check out your new tenant, right? There's some potential violations of the law there, but we'll leave that alone for now. the point is, right, they sell for $5 or $10, sometimes even 5 cents. We did a study Cloaked on this. Profiles on you, where you live, your phone number. So people for years, abusive individuals have bought this data to hunt people down. And this is now extending beyond just gendered violence. So people have done this to federal judges. There was a horrific case in 2020 where a federal judge's 20-year-old son was murdered in her home because of this data. This is happening in New Jersey to law enforcement officers. So there's a real sort of threat to the individual. Another big issue I'll highlight is scamming and phishing. So there have been cases of data brokers selling data on elderly people and their phone numbers and who has Alzheimer's to criminals because they got paid. And the criminals then steal millions of dollars from those people because they have this great list that says, here's someone vulnerable and here's how to contact them, right? So we've seen scam, phishing, cybersecurity risks that affect individuals and businesses. And the last one I'll just touch on is really invasive inferences about our life. So you mentioned Arjun location, which is a great example, right? So if you think of location data, it's not just seeing where someone is at any point in time. You're also learning about their routine. When do they go to work in the morning? Do they drop their kids off at school, right? You're also seeing everywhere they go. And I've published studies, Sarah's done work, others have done work looking at specific examples of things you can learn from location data. You can see who's going to a mosque or a church or a synagogue, who's going to a gay bar, who's going to a cancer treatment clinic. People have tracked military officials driving around. They've tracked police officers. They've tracked people at protests, right? So you can learn a lot from all this data and gets back to this point that once these companies have it, they can do all kinds of things with it that are way beyond what we would ever expect or imagine or want for our own information. So I will toss it to Sarah for her thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That was a really great overview and explanation of, I think that gives plenty of proof as to why people should care. I would just add, so one thing I always talk about, because in my teaching role, I'm constantly teaching people who have grown up in an internet environment. They're like, why do I care? Like, I'm online. I don't see, whatever you want. But one thing that comes up again and again is something called the creepy factor, the creepiness factor. There is a point for each of us where data choices are creepy. Like, oh, I don't care if people see what I post on Facebook. I don't care if people see my direct messages. I don't care. Well, do you care if people can see your health information that's stored on your electronic, health files? Do you care if people can see every click that you are making on the internet all the time, right? Like there is a level where it becomes too invasive and it becomes creepy.
There's a threshold, sounds like, right?
Right. Everybody has there's always a point where it gets creepy.
Exactly. Yeah. Some people have a very low threshold, like I'm concerned, and you reach a point where it's like, wait, I actually don't like what's going on.
Right. There's always a breaking point. And back before the internet, privacy was, the ability to keep something hidden from view. Now, in today's iteration of privacy, so much of it is about control and transparency. So you might not care that people can see what you put online. Like you might not care that somebody can track your location, but truthfully, there's so much data. We are creating so much data all the time that we don't know where our data is going. We don't know what kind of data we're generating, and we don't know how it's used. And you can imagine probably dozens of ways that data that you're not even aware is being tracked. Every keystroke you make in a search, like all of those things could be being tracked, and you don't know who can access them, who can buy them, who can share them. And that's creepy.
So that whole idea of every keystroke being tracked, and now that we're saying that we're feeding some of this data. I don't know if you even read it, that somebody put a proof of concept online that showed how easily AI could go ahead and adjust somebody's information, go into Gmail, draft a very specific phishing opportunity, send it, and compromise someone. As we look at the year ahead in 2025, what's the big kind of aspects of the data broker industry we should really index on? We've known the problem, and it's getting worse. This year, how should we really think about this data broker industry? What are even some actions we should keep in the back of our mind that both we hope people are taking and what we should be thinking about? So I'll check it. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I'll say two things. right now in our current legal ecosystem, there's no comprehensive federal data broker legislation, right? So services like Cloaked become much more important in an environment where these systems and these products are completely unregulated on a federal level. You are in charge of your own privacy. You can pick and choose how your data gets out there, but ultimately there's no safeguards on this industry. Some states, there are emerging state law regimes, which which some are better than others and they're varying, but it really creates a patchwork across the 50 states where there's no consistent way to get transparency or consent or privacy, the privacy that you're probably hoping for. There was one other thing I was going to say on that, but I don't remember.
Justin, double click on the legislation side of things. I know, jumping to Justin for a second, but if we're talking legislation coming ahead this year, what are things that and I guess both of you might have thoughts on here, but what do we see kind of coming up and what are the good and the bad from both sides? I know I've been directly talking and working through, there's a patchwork legislation going on. We don't have a federal approach, but what's coming ahead and how should we think about it? And ultimately, I kind of see where we're headed, which is that we'll actually need to think about how do we actually make some impact in this privacy space? Because it's not going to be just regulation. We have to figure out what they're going to be doing, but also things that we need to do as individuals as part of this overall ecosystem. But I'd turn to just thoughts, but go ahead.
It's going to be the same, state federal. So until there's a citywide, ordinance on data brokers, but somewhere. But yeah, so first is state, as Sarah mentioned. So California had a law that was recently passed called the Delete Act. This is a fantastic law, and I think we need this law all across the country. And there's no further evidence of how much we need this than it had over close to 90% public support in California to allow people to have a one-stop shop, to tell some data brokers to not sell some of their data without their consent. Crazy concept, right? And yet the data brokers lobbied so aggressively against it and in fact wanted to prohibit people from having a one-stop shop to opt out. So that's a really good model, I think, for enabling more removal of data from the internet, enabling people to take more control over what's sold about them. So I hope we see that model in other states. Federally, it'll be interesting because, of course, we're now headed into a time where one party will control both the executive branch as well as both chambers of Congress. And so the past two cycles, as Sarah referenced, we've had what are called comprehensive federal privacy laws. They're always not the best, but move closer to passage. And there actually is a lot of bipartisan consensus about what should be in them. There's some dispute about a couple things, which are pretty important, and we won't get into that here, a little wonky. But the point is that could be of interest in the next 2 years for this next Congress. So we'll have to see. But to your point, that leaves all of our data floating around and sold all over the place in the interim. And so people still need to, and businesses still need to do, like Sarah said, what we can right now to actually lock down. Laws are great and we need more laws, but you also can't wait for laws. So you need to do stuff in the interim.
Interesting. So I think the idea, right? So policymakers, you got to, this Delete Act and a few of these examples we're seeing that are working. We do want to say, hey, this is a template that we'd love to see moving forward. So if for any policymaker, especially since at Cloak, we're trying to talk to folks, here's a good template to talk through. But you're right. Federal privacy bill, a federal approach to this problem is something that we want to keep championing. But as we're thinking about kind of that dimension of legislation and our actions we can take, this year alone, we know that velocity is increasing, right? So then that's the big takeaway I'm hearing, that 2025, this is going to be, we've seen the growth rate go up. We're going to see it go up even further. So from our side, who should we be talking to first? And maybe Sarah, if you want to jump in, should we kind of go hard on the policymaker discussion and really championing, or is it some other answer? Where is this kind of, how are we kind of thinking about this problem today for this coming year?
I mean, I think in the immediate, I like Justin am uplifted to know that data privacy is a bipartisan issue. Like creepiness is creepy, no matter who you are. data, like lack of data privacy and the idea of data brokering is inherently creepy. So I do think that there is a fair chance that maybe new legislation will be advanced. Maybe the Delete Act, will have similar analogs in other states. But I really do think right now, without, as Justin said, in the meantime, our first line of defense is self-protection, education. We, of course, should encourage lawmakers to do what needs to be done to put safeguards on this industry. But we also have to keep in mind that even when these safeguards are placed, Justin made a good point. We've seen laws that have passed in other places. None of them offer complete control and protection of your own data, right? So any instances where that kind of protection can be created with or without legislation would be really helpful.
So yeah, go ahead, Justin. Yeah, jump in.
No, I endorse. We can move on.
Well, so it's something we kind of danced around the topic, so I kind of jump into it then full head on is this taking control aspect. So we know data brokers, the aspect of data collection is getting worse. I think personally, from what we're observing here at Cloaked, is that in 2025 we're going to be observing some legislative pushing, and I think I'd love to kind of see and talk about in a second what are the key points that the net policymakers need to get right. But from the taking back control, as we get into that, is that what are the actions and steps that actually manifests as? I think one, it's funny, we talked about earlier, well, there's a threshold, but funny enough, people who say they don't care about people looking at the data, these same people who have Finstas. They have like a alternative Instagram because they don't want some people to see this data on Instagram here. We see this in even Gen Alpha. I want to share my Snapchat as opposed to my phone number because I'm a little concerned. So where people are not maybe screaming out loud and saying, I want digital privacy, but there's actions that people are trying to take. I'd say before we get to the policy side, but what people should focus on, let's talk about control. What are the things that people could do? I'm not here to go use Cloaked, but that's one thing I know I'd say. But from the perspective, what does that look like from the actions people are taking? Because it's already manifesting, it's happening.
Well,
So go ahead, kick us off.
Yeah, I want to make a broader point first, which is that you can go look in newspaper archives and find over and over and over time companies and media and whoever else saying no one cares about privacy these days, nobody cares anymore, everyone's complacent. So there are elements of truth to that feeling, and yet that's also, I want to point out, very much what industry these companies would love everyone to feel, right? Because if you feel powerless and you feel complacent, you don't complain, you don't say, as Sarah said, hey, this is creepy. And there are decades and decades of articles of companies completely dismissing the fact that people think things are creepy, which is, unethical. But anyway, just to make that point, right, that yes, is one individual going to topple, multi-billion-dollar tracking ecosystems? No, but feeling powerless is actually what these companies want. And so that leads to my second point, which is I think advocating around this stuff is really important. And this becomes more practical when we get back to the state laws I referenced, right? So the Delete Act, again, is a great model. I hope we see that pop up in some states in the country in the next year. In California, there were plenty of folks, individuals, who were active on saying, hey, I actually do care about this. I care that some company I've never heard of is selling my health information to a marketer. I care that my email's floating around online and I'm getting these weird phone calls, or I'm worried about an ex who, liked looking at my social media a little too much, right? So, people advocating and even just telling their local representative, hey, this bothers me, I think is really, really impactful. Sarah, is that fair?
Absolutely. And I would add one thing I always tell my students, because I think a lot of people are like, well, if you don't like the data collection, just don't use the system.
Don't use it. Binary option.
Right. That's not, that I always tell my students, like, none of us is going to go to the ocean and throw our computer in the ocean, right? None of us is going to like toss our phone that we need over a bridge and, run over it with a car. Right. We are not, we should not have to opt out from the entire digital world in order to exist, and nor can we. So I think it's kind of empowering to remember to not think of this as a binary. We should be able to use all of the things that we enjoy and avail ourselves of all of the benefits of digital life without having to worry that we are going to be exploited and that our data is going to be exploited.
So that's something that I always love to think about. There's 3.4 billion people using Chrome, right? So the answer, the narrative is that, all right, well, stop using it. There's that. So that can't be the way we think about this,
No.
right? So we take a step back. All right, we've got different types of data brokers, the kind of malicious ones, and we got the gray area between the Googles, et cetera. Well, if there's a business that's just trying to make a better experience for customers, how do we actually talk about promoting this idea for privacy or protecting people better when there's not a lot of good outlets? What are some good actions that a business can think about where they're just trying to get data to make something better for consumers? So what does privacy mean for them, and how should they view it? So I'd say, Sarah, why don't you kick us off and Justin jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think there are companies can have good data practices, right? And a lot, so most data brokers do not, because their entire profit model is selling personal data. So they want to collect and sell. But if you're a company that is, like you said, improving consumers' user experience through data, then if you be very explicit about how you are going to use people's data and keep that use very limited to serve the goal that of to do whatever needs to be done with it to enhance consumers experience on your platform with your service, and then expunge the data, get rid of the data, don't hold on to data forever. Holding on to people's data is very risky. It creates huge security risks. If that data is ever leaked, if it's ever, if the system is ever hacked, you are subjecting the consumers whose data you have to risk of data leak exposure. So expunge data, set narrow usage parameters on that data. Don't collect more data than is needed, and be very explicit with consumers. And if you really want to do consumers, a solid, make sure that they can opt out if they don't want their data collected. You can say, hey, your user experience might not be as great, here's why, but you don't have to give us your data.
Yeah, all of that, I think, and as Sarah said, there are lots of companies that use data ethically, that have strong security practices, that follow principles. She mentioned like data minimization. This is not that every company on earth is like, number one on the exploitative privacy list, right? It's so, I mean, one principle I think would be don't sell data, but another I think Sarah was getting at is it's just important to, yeah, if you're using data, it needs to be data that people consent to. And again, there are lots of companies that already do this. The consumers consent, they use data in ways that you expect them to. For example, I mean, I'm not going to reference a specific company because I haven't audited them myself, but like, if I use a ride sharing app, right? Okay. I would like the app to track my location because when I leave the building, I don't want to have to, what's the street address? And because that's annoying and I'm lazy. And the second reason is because for safety, like I'm glad that they're tracking my location when I'm in that car and if something happens, right? So there's cases like that where companies use data in line with how you expect and with the permissions you turn on, and it's totally fine. And like you said, it improves the experience for the individual. So yeah, I think it's just underscoring that, anytime we talk about these issues, any of us here, anyone generally, about data sale, it's exploitative, how do we take back control? Data brokers often attempt to portray that as an attack on tech everywhere, or data everywhere. Oh, you hate innovation, or oh, actually, all companies do this, and so if you regulate us, you're going to take down the industry. And it actually, when you get into it, is obviously not the case. And there have been lots of data broker bills, including the Delete Act in California, that lots of companies have supported, or even just not said anything because they went, well, that doesn't affect us. We're not selling people's health data. We're not giving public records to DHS. Like, this has nothing to do with us. So, that's the other part, is realizing as huge as this data broker industry is, as entrenched as they are in society, they're also an outlier in terms of how the entire rest of industry and the tech industry uses data. And so it really, that is a really important thing for us all to remember.
It's that there's two sides to this coin, people trying to figure out what's best. Now, the other dimension, which we won't get into today, is when a breach happens, that's also kind of leads to a whole leakage of this.
Right.
But we have about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to do close out. One, we had a question from the audience, and love to hear some closing thoughts. But first, a question to the audience, and I love both your thoughts here. Is this is kind of a surprise from the ask, which is exactly what I wanted to get to. Is what do you think policymakers need to be thinking about specifically? Maybe some, and I'm now adding key points in order to make real gains in the privacy space. One of the maybe the top side of things, top 3 or top 4 that people should be really focusing on. So I'll let Justin maybe kick us off, and go Sarah, maybe close it out there.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. One, bipartisan consensus, right? Again, the details, yes, those have to be fought over, but it's pretty widespread that people perceive that a couple entrenched tech players have too much power and people need to be able to use services in a way where they have control of their privacy. Okay, that's pretty bipartisan. Let's focus on that. Second thing is recognizing, as I mentioned, that the sale of data is particularly dangerous because of what it enables. And the third, which we haven't really actually touched on, and I've written a fair amount about this, is actually national security, which is that there's also a tremendous threat to our national security because it's so easy to acquire. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I've done studies where we did this. Like, oh, we just went and bought special operations bases financial data with no background, whatever. Okay, there's things like this because the data is all over the place that it's actually a threat to the country. This has also been recognized on a bipartisan basis. So, again, that's not to say privacy regulation is like that's why you do it, but the point is there are lots of benefits from privacy regulation, like enabling innovative tech companies to use data responsibly, helping people take back control. National security is another benefit.
I just to add there, I know you've done research of this, but I won't name names, but like even dating apps where there's military generals, people on there, and people have conducted psyops, foreign entities trying to unpack, target these specific individuals. But you're right, there's such a big dimension in that regard. But Sarah, why don't you jump in there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ignoring the dangers that these kind of practices place on our national security is a big mistake, especially because other countries are doing a better job than us, and other countries are keenly aware of those data security risks. Yeah, we should be aware of them and address them as well. What I always say when it comes to kind of starting to really seriously consider regulation, that don't completely shut down all data collection and good data use and all the benefits that we have from the data industry. I always go back to something, once again, related to the Privacy Act of 1974 called the Fair Information Practice Principles. So before the final, iteration of that law was passed and enacted, there was a huge amount of research done. This was at the era where databases were just becoming a thing, and like people immediately realized that connectivity in databases would ultimately lead to the collection of personal data and possibly the misuse of that data. So they really set out to like govern and create safeguards on data collection for the very first time. And the fair information practices include letting all the things I've already alluded to, making sure that people have an opt-in and not an opt-out, making sure that all data collection is shut off until a person agrees to turn it on, right? And that's opt-in versus opt-out. Transparency around what kind of records are going to be collected and how they're going to be used. Very good data records management that involves regular deletion and minimization. And also the data security part that we were talking about, making sure that once an entity collects data, it is safe, it is secure, and nobody else can get it. And also, one thing that comes up a lot today is third parties being able to access data. So before a company sends your data downstream, upstream, any direction, they have to inform you and you have to give permission for that data to be shared. I think those are just some really basic, like these concepts are over 50 years old. Yeah, like we should be enacting them and encoding them.
Well, that's one big kind of summary of how we would use defined is if we can create extreme transparency and data record management, like that's a easy first step. That fine, these things are all going on, but if we create that, it creates a less creepy factor for individuals and charts some path forward. So I really love that kind of those are really basic tenets of policymakers and even business start thinking about will create some wins going forward. But we're kind of coming on time, so we'll have to close this out. But first, I mean, our last question for today, I'd love from each of you, and maybe Sarah to kick us off and Justin close out, that can you tell us your top privacy prediction or maybe the most important trend for the year ahead we should reflect on? Maybe Sarah start us off and go ahead, Justin, after that.
Okay, so I'm not going to predict that government use of data is going to decline. I don't think that that's in the cards for us, but I am hopeful that there might be some real consideration on a federal level of some sort of data management act, because no matter who's in office, it's something that people like. And since we do have a bipartisan, or we do have a agreement in our bicameral legislature, maybe there's a chance.
There's a chance. Interesting. Data. Yeah,
Sarah took my government joke, so go ahead, Arjun. Sorry.
No. Go ahead, Justin.
I'll just add, because I gotta mention the buzzwords, right? But AI, machine learning, right? More and more, that's gonna be my prediction. We're already seeing this, but more and more demands for data to train these systems, right? And so lots of ways to do it. Like you said, I mean, you might violate copyright law, but companies scrape the internet, whatever. Another way is buying it. And we've seen in the last 18 months, companies that never sold data in their life. They were in that bucket we talked about, using it with consent, doing it with, that now sell data because they make money because they sell it to AI trainers. So I think we're going to see that more in the next year.
That's I think both your sides I fully align with. Personally, from my perspective and Cloaked, I think the next year the demand for data we know has been increasing, but now it's moving exponentially on consumption, training, acting on this information. So I think the key principles that next year we will see some movement, as you kind of suggest, around training, and Sarah around transparency and what does data management look like. I think there's going to be some big shift. Now, my hope is we're part of that as Cloaked, but the idea is that I think ultimately, because there's a growing demand of what does creepiness look like, and everyone trying to get more and more, the goal from a lot of companies, like how close I get to the individual, where I know everything about them and can even predict the next action. Where that pace is now almost an exponential point. And so I think next year, my big prediction is that somebody and combination legislation and company is going to start saying, all right, you want more training, you want more information. Here's how things are going to start working to make things easier, smarter for both businesses and people. So I agree with both sides. But that's it for today. I really appreciate the time today for talking privacy security. I don't think this will be our last conversation. This whole next year is going to be pretty exciting. As I said, government's changing. The way we're approaching things, people are becoming more aware. So I'd love to thank the guests who joined us for today. And if you have any additional questions, we'd love to ingest and can connect and pull information from both Sarah and Justin. But please visit us at cloaked.com or reach us out at info@cloaked.com. We're happy to answer questions. We know this narrative about privacy and security is not going to be a one side solves everything. It's going to be some combination of legislative, businesses, and ultimately people having the right to defend themselves. And if we can make that true, I think next year we'll see some bigger wins as we're trying to navigate this question of AI and businesses knowing everything. But thanks for the time, and I appreciate it.